Okay, I'm Kyle Hutchison. I am a partner in a multiple generation family farm here on the shore, headquartered in Cordova, Talbot County. And I guess my cousin and I are the fifth generation. There's the two of us, and then his father, my father, and an uncle still involved. At one time, there was 5 brothers that farmed together. And we're a truly family farm operation. There's the 5 of us, and we have 1 full-time hired guy and a couple part-time help. But other than that, we do it all. So we farm here on the midshore in Talbot and Caroline counties. Corn, wheat, feed barley, seed barley, malting barley, cucumbers, pickling cucumbers, baby lima beans, green peas. That's probably about it. It's about 7 or 8 different crops. So, and we try to be stewards. I guess we feel like that, farm profitability and good environmental practices don't have to be mutually exclusive. So they can be combined. We believe that. So we've been involved over the years in a lot of different practices, conservation wise, and we'll continue to do so.
So that leads almost perfectly into our second question, which was what kind of conservation practices do you implement or have in place on your farms, whether they be easements, soil health management, habitat restoration? Just love to know more about what you do.
Right. Yes, we certainly believe in preserving farmland. So we have land that is in rural legacy easements and also MALF, Maryland Ag Land Foundation easements also. To preserve farming on the shore, you got to preserve the resource, which is the land. So we're believers in that. And actually the last farm that was purchased in 2010, we probably couldn't have done it without putting an easement on it at the same time we purchased it, because that made the balance affordable after we were able to receive money for the easement. We do all kinds of conservation practices. We're certainly big into cover crops and have been since the beginning. I look back in 2021, we planted 85% of our eligible acres to cover crops. And the only reason we didn't plant the other 15% was because we ran out of time with the seeding deadline. I mean, we would plant 100% if we could. We practice several different types of nitrogen management and apply many times over the growing season to meet the crop needs. We practice no-till. We have 3 nitrogen bioreactors on farms that we own and might possibly do some more. We started the first one of those 8 years ago. And it was more of experimental practice back then. They were trying to figure out how they worked. And I think it's to the point now it's a proven practice. And I would guess we're going to talk more about that later. And then we've also lately gotten into some drainage water management. And that's a big thing with the 2025 WIP goals. And Shore Rivers is working on that also. And we did a partner site with them in Caroline County 3 years ago. And that's been working well. So, and I'm sure there's a couple other things I've forgotten, but that's a basic overview.
I had seen in one of your photos that you had sent by that it seemed like you had like a wetland of sorts over one of the bioreactors.
Correct. The wetland was where we did the tile drainage
Gotcha.
project, or the drainage water management project, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of the wetland there was, in the picture you can see the white pipe sticking out of the bank on the right hand side, and the tile lines from the field drain into that wetland. That was a created wetland. It was not there before. So it was a created wetland. And then the water stays in there a while, unless some of the nutrients and sediments settle out before it's outletted into the stream. So it is a, I guess, nutrient management, sediment management practice there. And that was done in conjunction with Shore Rivers, Tim Rosen and Shore Rivers.
So if I can ask, along with Shore Rivers, who else have you worked with to implement these practices? What other organizations?
Certainly the local soil conservation district is big in helping. I actually serve on the board. I'm the treasurer in Talbot County, and I serve on the board of the Talbot County Soil Conservation District. They've certainly got many practices, too many to name really. There's just, if you're interested in something, you can probably find some funding to do it. So there's lots of interest there. And NRCS also, which is another government organization. We've also worked with Ridge to Reefs on one of the bioreactor projects. Andrew Koslow was involved in that. That's all I can think of right at the moment.
Oh, it's interesting. We haven't had anyone mention Ridge to Reefs before. So that's a little different than what we've typically heard. I did hear you briefly mention funding for these kinds of projects. Do you find that most of these implementations do have like some kind of a cost share funding or like an incentive payment behind them, or are they more so like returns on investments?
To this point, there's been a funding source behind them. For example, the bioreactors were funded with grants. We said we would provide the land and maintenance. And as I mentioned, it was an experimental practice at that time. I don't even know how many there is in the whole state of Maryland, maybe 10 or 12. There isn't that many, period, even at this time. But that was an experimental practice, so there was grant funding for that. The drainage project was they were looking at subsurface drainage versus surface drainage and quantifying the sediments and nutrients in both to determine what is the best way to drain and make productive farmland. That particular farm had been tile drained in the 1950s and it was failing. So this was just basically retrofitting a system that was already there. And there are, I mean, the funding does help things get a return on investment for sure. Sometimes things won't work without some funding. I mean, you would not be able to afford to do it. Some of that may be changing with some of the bay restoration funds as they're moving away from treating sewage, working on sewage treatment plants to more of an agricultural focus. There may be different ways to get return on investment using funds like that, but that's kind of in the future. That's not really happening right now.
So I'm also curious to know which one of your conservation practices perhaps took the longest to implement, whether it be from initial inquiry to the relevant office to actually being, in the ground and functional. Did you find that there might have been some like hindrances to your farming operation to permit the time it would take to implement some of this?
From a time perspective or from a learning curve perspective, there's a difference in my mind, I guess.
I guess we're looking at a time perspective, because I know a lot of the applications for cost shares in different programs are kind of on like an annual cycle with a deadline and a waiting list.
Right, and there's engineering components that have to be completed, and there's standards that have to be met. And sometimes that gets a little frustrating because you get on the list and it takes time to work through that. but I guess I really haven't been disappointed in anything. I mean, I guess I expect that it is a process and that it takes time. So I don't, that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't, doesn't upset me if, if it drags on for years, yes, but 6 months, a year, that's just seems to be typical anymore. So.
Right.
I can't say one over the other. Now, some of the practices that we've chosen to do on the farm have a learning curve, so that's a little different, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious to know more about that, but I think I maybe want to ask first. So after you implement the practice, then, the time has elapsed, it's in the ground, it's working. For example, like the Eastern Shoreland Conservancy sends a stewardship monitor out once a year to check the condition of the easement. Do you have any other kinds of monitors or check-ins for any of your other practices from an organization?
The bioreactors have to be maintained and they're checked on. But really not a whole lot, but I guess we, as farmers, we do more than anything because I'm there every day and I see it. So I'm the one that really monitors it, or somebody on the farm, somebody that's knowledgeable. I do all the application on our farm, so I'm across every acre on the farm probably 5 times every year. So I see things throughout the growing season, pay attention to things. So it really comes back to the manager or the owner, really, I think, most of the time.
Right. So would you mind then elaborating a little bit on what you meant by sometimes there's a learning curve behind implementing some of these practices?
Sure. This probably isn't where you're going. May not help you a whole lot. I'm not sure what the audience is. But for example, nitrogen management is a big deal. And we typically will use 3 approaches to managing our nitrogen in corn. We'll make split applications. So in a corn crop, we'll apply nitrogen 5 times throughout the growing season to try to match application to crop needs. But when it comes to the side dress application, which is the last application, we typically go later in the growing season when the corn is 4 to 5 foot tall, and we pull nitrate tests from the soil to determine how much residual nitrogen is there. We also lately have been doing the Cornell Adapt-N program, which is a nitrogen modeling program. And then the third thing that we're doing is we run active sensors. So the application rig that I run has sensors on it, and it reads biomass and chlorophyll. And as you go across the field, it will change the rate that you're applying based on an algorithm and certain parameters that you have in there. But what it basically does is it applies the nitrogen where it is most needed in the field. Normally you would go out there and say, if this field needs 50 pounds of nitrogen, you would put 50 pounds across every acre on the whole field. Or this sensor can say, you just went through that area, or you're going through that area, and the corn, it was too wet and it drowned it out, and it's yellow and it's 2 inches tall and it's never going to make grain. So we're not going to apply anything there. It's going to be a 0. So it just moves the nitrogen around in the field, and I feel that's a better use of resources. And that took 3 or 4 years to grasp that concept.
That's really
but I like a challenge. I like a challenge. And the other thing with the problem with using 3 approaches is sometimes you get 3 different answers. And then which one, they all have some science behind them, but which one is right?
Mm,
You've got to make a subjective decision on which one you think is right, because you've got all the input correctly in, but it gives you three different answers, and sometimes the answers are vastly different.
right.
It's a very inexact. In nature, it's just hard to manage. It's tricky. So we just try to do the best we can.
So what are some of the benefits do you think you've been seeing from implementing these conservation practices? I mean, those benefits can be economic, environmental, whatever you feel like you've really gained from choosing to apply them.
Right. Definitely for cover crops, they do prevent erosion. We're big believers in doing that for that reason. And they also provide actually weed suppression, which is for the herbicide for the following year, you can use less or different. You can't get away with zero, but you can use less. So that's definitely a benefit. I do believe we're seeing soil health benefits also from the practices. We do a lot of no-till, and I don't think I've mentioned that yet. And then we are looking into, we're going to do some strip till this year. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where you only till a 6-inch band that you're going to plant in, and you leave the rest of the soil undisturbed. So there's some soil health benefits there. If you can figure out how to afford the machine to do that, or if you can justify the cost, let's put it that way. And there's certainly environmental benefits too. Less sediment, less nutrients leaving your land, which is you pay to put them on there. I would like to see them there. I don't want them in the waterways either. So,
How about any potential negatives or drawbacks? Anything that hasn't gone quite to plan?
yes, of course, that's it. That's life, isn't it? Yes, the practices for the most part, the bioreactor, drainage, things like that, they pretty much take care of themselves, and they don't directly impact farmland per se. I mean, they may sit on farmland, but other than that area where they need to be, they're really not directly impacting what you're doing on the land. We've had a mixed experience with cover crops in that sometimes they invite some pests that I would normally not have to deal with, and I have to spray an extra time with an insecticide, or replant or do some other things because the cover crop was a host to a pest that destroyed part of the crop. So you can't really ever quite figure that out. It depends on the year, and you can manage the best you can, but it's a challenge sometimes. And sometimes you're not always going to be right, no matter what you do. You could do one thing this year and it'd be the exact right answer, and you do the same thing the following year and it could be the exact wrong answer. But that's when you're dealing with Mother Nature. That's the way it is. Just do the best you can.
That sounds like good advice to give to somebody who's maybe considering implementing some new practices. But knowing what you know now, having experience in these, is there anything else that you would caution a landowner or farmer who's interested in maybe adopting some of these practices?
I think you have to understand the contract, what's expected of you. That's very important. Sometimes those things get glossed over. But as far as the partners we have, I don't have any reservation with dealing with any of them. I like dealing with every one of them. So like I say, we'll continue to do so and do more in the future. So
Great. And then I guess one last question for you, which kind of draws on something that you had said earlier about like your beliefs, like you believe and applying a no-till practice. So what's prompted you to start implementing these practices in the first place? Like what really drew them to you, or what is it that you believe in?
The farming and our agriculture it's all in a continuum. I mean, you're always trying to do better. I always try to do, yeah, we might be doing pretty good, but you could always be doing better. So I like to strive, and we like the challenge of doing things, improving all the time. So it's not, you don't get to the finish line and you're done. It's like I say, it's a continuum. You're always trying to do better, and be less impactful about what you have to do. I mean, for us, I mean, it's our business. We have to make a living. It's how I put food on the table. It's how I pay for my son's college. I mean, it's got to be profitable. So, but at the same time, you can implement some of these practices. And there's exciting things coming down the road. Biologicals are a big deal. We're actually trying 3 different ones this coming year. 2 of them help the plant fix nitrogen out of the air, and utilize it so you can reduce the nutrients that you have to apply. And the 3rd one makes the certain nutrients in the soil, nitrogen and phosphorus, more available to the plant. So that is the emerging science, I think, that's really gonna change things in the next 5 years, and maybe reduce our reliance on having to apply nutrients. Maybe we can do it less and get the same result or better. So
Great. Well, I think I've pretty much hit all of the major questions I wanted to ask you. So I guess I'll open to you now if there's anything that you'd like to elaborate on, or if there's anything you really want to get out there to the audience.
not really. I think we touched on most of my notes there. Would you like me to explain some of the pictures, or in the earlier map, the earlier year, the red and yellows are the areas that were severely impacted because they were too wet, because they were not, the soil was saturated and the corn plant basically drowned in those yellow areas and did not produce grain. So that was before we did the drainage tile project. And the other map is after we did it, and you can see it's mostly green. And then I circled, the areas that I circled have the yield. I queried an area within that, the area that I circled, and had the yield inside that number 142 or whatever the numbers are. That's the yield within that block, that queried area. So you'll see on the second map that's dark green, the yields are higher. And it shows an impact of what the drainage will do from an agronomic standpoint. So
that is quite a difference, just like flipping back and forth between the 2 photos.
And that's how you decide whether it's economically viable to do that kind of stuff or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have everything that we're doing is basically cloud-based now. So I've got at least 10 years of data that I can look back on and make decisions based on yield data and application data and other things. So that helps figure out which practices would be best for the farm. And
I'm always continually impressed by how much technology plays a role in conservation practices, especially just like tile drainage, having that little solar paneled box out in a field that collects data on where your water table is, and being able to program it. That just all really, for lack of better words, blows my mind.
Somebody smarter than us can figure that out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And then was there anything else that you wanted to mention about the bioreactors?
Not really. initial designs that we have were, they were experimental. So I think they've got it figured out now. Two of them really aren't functioning greatly now because of some design issues, I think. But the third one we have is better. So I think, but that's why we were willing to work with them because, or work with Shore Rivers and Ridge and Reefs was to figure this out. You know, somebody's got to be the guinea pig and start. So we said, we're willing to work with you. So that's the bioreactors, the data that we have, some of it is on that page that I showed you there. We tested it with Drew Coslow's help, or he tested it, and I tested it some too, over a 2-year period, I believe. It showed that it reduced the nitrate in the ditch water reduced it by 85%. So it took 85% of the nitrate out of the water once it went through it.